The Lord always keeps his promises. He is gracious in all he does. The Lord helps the fallen and lifts those bent beneath their loads. The eyes of all look to you in hope. You give them their food as they need it. When you open your hand, you satisfy the hunger and the thirst of every living thing. The Lord is righteous in everything he does. He is filled with kindness. The Lord is close to all who call on him. Yes, to all who call on him in truth. He grants the desires of those who fear him. He hears their cries for help and rescues them. The Lord protects all those who love him, but he destroys the wicked.
I started to, but I didn't. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Do I have control? It's an illusion. We never have control. Right. John, thank you for your class. It's a great introduction to the lesson today. We're still in the Sermon on the Mount looking at the Lord's Prayer. Give us today the bread that we need now. No matter where you go in the world, more than likely, no matter where you eat or what you eat, you will be served some staple food. Now, in the East, in the Asian countries, the staple food would be what? Rice. That's right. Rice would be the staple food of Asian countries. In fact, I've talked with Filipinos, and to them, if you don't have rice, you really are not eating. It's really not food. So rice is that important. Now, for countries in the West and the Middle East, the primary staple is food. I mean, it's food. Okay. I'll tell you what's going on in my mind right now. I'm thinking, okay, we're trying to keep things shorter here. I'm thinking, okay, I gotta move things along, and then it gets me all confused. But anyway, wheat or bread is staple in the West and in the Middle East, and there's all kinds of bread that we can eat in the world. Bread or barley. In the West, generally it's bread, all kinds of bread you can go buy and eat. And in the Middle East, it's flat bread, and there's quite a variety of flat bread. But anyway, Jesus said, give us today the bread that we need now. All right, the bread that we need now. Now, if you were here a few weeks ago when the leadership was away, there were a couple of videos from the Bible Project. One of those by Tim Mackey was an overview of the sermon. I think it's a brilliant, very good introduction to the sermon. If you remember, he said that the Lord's Prayer, if you look at the whole sermon, the way the sermon is constructed, the way it's structured, the Lord's Prayer is in the center of the center of the center of the sermon. And it's there deliberately. It's not just accidentally happened to be there. It's deliberately there. Prayer needs to occupy the central place in our lives. And so in this simple sentence, give us today the bread that we need now, Jesus is teaching us that we need to rely. We need to be dependent on God's provision for our life, for our sustenance. So this prayer, if we think about it and reflect upon it, exposes the level of our dependence on God, the level and the depth of our trust in God for our life, for our sustenance. And so the prayer moves from the beginning, focused on God, now to the petition, which the first one is, give us today. It focuses on our physical need, but it shapes us spiritually. In fact, let me just pause for a moment. We make a big deal between the difference between something physical and something spiritual, and what's most important is the spiritual, not so much the physical. The Bible does not make that distinction between the physical and the spiritual. It all runs together. The physical and spiritual actually are two sides of the same coin. They're not two different coins. Two different sides of the same coin. They relate to one another. They affect one another. So in trying to value and see how important the spiritual things are, don't devalue physical because they go together. So Jesus is saying, give us today the bread that we need now, the things we need to live. It's important. And so Jesus prays, and he teaches us to pray, Our Father in heaven, may your name be honored. May your kingdom come. May your will be done, as in heaven, so on earth. Give us today the bread we need now. And forgive us of the things we owe, as we too have forgiven what was owed to us. Don't bring us into the great trial, but rescue us from evil, or from the evil one. Many people in Jesus' audience that day, in fact, most of the people in the audience that day that Jesus gave the sermon were poor, very poor. And literally for many of them, maybe most of them, they lived day to day to day, not knowing if they would eat tomorrow or not. Food insecurity was a reality for them. And most of those people may have been what's called day laborers. They didn't get a job, a permanent kind of job. They would go to find a job each day and get paid at the end of the day. So they would literally only have enough money to buy bread for the day. And going to bed hungry was probably a reality for many people in Jesus' audience. I have never gone to bed hungry because there was nothing to eat in the house. And I've gone to bed hungry because I chose to, or I was sick, couldn't eat. Maybe some of you have experienced that. My parents did. My parents grew up poor, both of them. I remember my dad comes originally from a family of 13 siblings. But when he was a little boy, there were 10 siblings in the house, and he remembers that when he went to school, several times he was about 10 or 11, his teacher would tell the other children to share their lunch with my dad because he had no lunch. He had no food. So my parents know what it was like to go to bed hungry because there was no food in the house, at least my dad. I've personally not experienced that. Maybe you have. So I look at this, I read this, give us today the bread we need now. How do I connect with this, what Jesus is saying here? Who would more likely be aware of their total dependence on God? A day laborer in Africa who makes just enough money to buy bread to feed his food for the day? Or would it be me who sits down to eat a 3-course spaghetti meal consisting of, spaghetti with delicious sauce, a salad, and garlic bread, and still have a pantry filled with food? Who would more likely be aware of their dependence on God? So this is the challenge. And I thought when I would, and I chose, okay, I'll do this part of the sermon. I thought, this is kind of an easy one to do. I mean, it's easy. Give us today the bread we need now. But when I began to reflect and think about this, how do I demonstrate my total dependence on God? How do we do that? Because Jesus is asking his audience, telling his audience, who many of them were probably hungry, listening to Jesus, that, you are dependent on God, and you need to ask God each day for the bread that you need each day. It's hard for us living in an affluent world to pray this prayer, I think, or this part of the prayer. It's hard because we don't think about it. We open up our fridge and there's food in there, I remember reading a story by Chuck Swindoll. He was in the story on being a servant. And he's telling the story of an American soldier after World War II in London, England, in the winter when things were still very scarce. He was walking down the street. He sees this young boy with his nose pressed against the window looking into the shop. And he walked up to it. It was a bakery. And this little boy who didn't have any money, who couldn't, buy bread, he was hungry, and he was just looking at that bread inside the shop, knowing that He couldn't have any. The American soldier saw what was going on, so he goes in the shop, he buys some bread, and he comes out and he gives it to that boy. And he starts walking away, and the boy calls out, "Sir," and he turns around. The boy says, "Are you Jesus?" Give us today the bread we need now. When Jesus said this, his audience would have connected. They would have heard an echo of the story in the Old Testament. What story is being echoed in these words of Jesus? Manna. Yeah. When in Egypt, God's people had food to eat. They had food to eat. Now they're in the wilderness, and the wilderness does not produce food, and they are hungry, and they are complaining, and they are grumbling. But God provides for them manna every day, and they had enough for each day. They could not hoard it for the next day, because if they hoarded it, when they woke up the next morning, what they've kept was spoiled. No, they had to go out every day and gather the manna for the day. All right, later Moses says to them in Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 3, and remembering this time, he says, He humbled you. God humbled them. How did God humble them? He said, by letting you hunger, and then by feeding you with manna, with which neither you nor your ancestors were acquainted, in order to make you understand that one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. So Jesus is asking his audience to join their ancestors in the wilderness and to trust God to provide the bread they need each day instead of grumbling and complaining. And it's such a good thing that today we do not ever grumble or complain. Yeah. The Lord's Prayer is in the middle of the sermon. Everything in the sermon revolves around the Lord's Prayer, I believe. If you look at this, what's the middle part of the Lord's Prayer? This is the middle of the center of the center of the center of the center. Give us today the bread we need now. Now, if we had time, because I would love to talk about, there's a couple of challenging things in this little sentence here. In fact, some biblical scholars, and a couple of biblical scholars said that this word, one of the words in here, the word that's translated daily, is one of the great unresolved puzzles of New Testament lexicography. But we're not going to go there. But I want you to know there is some challenging things here in this sermon. But this sermon, this prayer. If I say sermon, I mean the prayer, okay? Notice how it begins. It begins with us looking up to God, our Father in heaven. Hallowed is your name, or may your name be honored. May your kingdom come. May your will be done in heaven as on earth, or so on earth. Your name, your kingdom, your will. That just focus our whole being on God. And now in verse 11, there are three petitions. There are three references to God: His kingdom, His name, His kingdom, His will, and then there are three petitions: give us, forgive us, and rescue us. Give us, forgive us, and rescue us. First of all, God comes first, and then our needs. Because God is who He is. He's a holy God. He's a sovereign God, but He's a Father. He is the source for meeting our needs, including our daily needs. Give us today the bread we need now. And this is not individual prayer, by the way. It's our Father, not my Father, not give me, forgive me. It's our Father. This is the prayer the church recites together, prays together. This is the community prayer. It's an us prayer. So Jesus is asking us to trust in God, that God will provide for our daily needs, not our daily wants, our daily needs. God will provide that which is sufficient to live. Daily bread means daily trust. And this is the challenge, because and I'm talking about myself, I don't think about this every day. But someone who is hungry, someone who is not guaranteed to eat, how are they going to eat? They have to depend on God. They have to depend on God. We need to depend upon God because we are dependent on God. God gives us bread. God gives us the very breath that we breathe. God gives us all of these things every day. We're not to hoard them. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, Moses, I wish we could read the whole chapter. We're not going to read the whole chapter. We're starting in verse 11. And this may be where we can relate more to this part here. They're about to enter the land, and Moses is saying, when you enter the land, don't forget. He's telling them to remember what God has done for you. Don't forget God. He says, take care that you do not forget the Lord your God. Don't forget the Lord your God. Don't take your eyes off of God. Don't forget the Lord your God by failing to keep His commandments, His ordinances, and His statutes, which I'm commanding you today. When you have eaten your fill, when you have eaten your fill and have built fine houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks have multiplied, and your silver and gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then do not exalt yourself, forgetting the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrible wilderness and arid wasteland with poisonous snakes and scorpions. He made water flow for you from flint rock, and fed you in the wilderness with manna that your ancestors did not know, to humble you and to test you, and in the end to do you good. Do not say to yourself, my power and the might of my own hand have gotten me this wealth. But remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you power to get wealth, so that He may confirm His covenant that He swore to your ancestors, as He is doing today. And he goes on. Don't forget God. Remember God. Even though our cupboards may have some food in them, even though we may have a warm house to live in, all of these things, we need to realize that we are still dependent on God. He has provided for us these things. We're not owed these things. That's so hard, I think, for us. He does not owe us these things. God gives us these things because He is generous. But Jesus is talking about here the basic provisions of life. Give us today the bread we need now. We tend to worry, I think, in our first world environment, our first world culture, about our survival. Not in the same way maybe as these people did, but our survival. We're concerned about, do we have enough money to buy food? Are we able to pay off our debts? Can we afford to pay the power bill? Can we afford to retire? What's going to happen tomorrow? These are questions that we deal with, things that we deal with, and let's not forget God. And I can think of several occasions in Mary's and my life in the past when we, in the past, we didn't have as much as we do now. We have more now than we did then. And a lot of times we had to really watch what we spent. There was very limited resources. And I can remember several occasions where, like, where's the money going to be coming from? Well, we can pay for this or pay for that. Literally, we didn't have enough in the bank to pay for this. And just in those kind of situations, all of a sudden money would show up some way. God is taking care of us. But it's easy to forget. It's easy to forget that we are dependent on God. We may have a tendency to hoard our resources, sometimes at the expense of others. We take because we need. We take because we need these things. And if you recall in our series we did earlier, I think last year, the story of God, when we sort of did an overview of the story of the Bible. Remember back in Genesis chapter 3 when Eve sees the fruit, what does she do? She sees it, it's desiring, so she grabs it, she takes it, she sees and she takes. And the rest of the story. So is that how we live? Do we are seizing and taking? Do we live as if we are dependent upon God? Jesus is asking us to live a different way, not tight-fisted, not just seeing and taking for ourselves, but He's asking us to live open-handed, because when He says, give us today, it's an open-handed stance because we're begging. We're begging for God, please God, give us today what we need now, the bread we need now. It's an open-handed stance before God. I think that's so hard to do. So how do we, people who are living in an affluent world, affluent society, affluent culture, who have more than enough to survive, how do we pray this prayer? How do we respond to Jesus? Do we live as if we're totally dependent on God for our survival? Is that in our minds? Is that in our thinking? Do we live that? Is this our stance toward God? Is this our stance toward our lives? I have a few things that we can do to remind us not to forget God, but to realize that we are dependent on God and we need to live that way. So begin each day with open hands, asking God to give us what we need for the day. What we need for the day, open hands. That's a physical thing. Remember, it's a two sides of the same coin. Open hands. Get in the habit of giving thanks, being grateful. Not to take things for granted. I think that's the danger, is taking things for granted, not being thankful, not in the habit of giving thanks. So be grateful when you sit down to eat, to have food, and give thanks to God. It's so easy for it to become a habit. But habits are good. But be thankful that we have this food, that we can eat, that we can survive, we can live. Recognize that we are dependent on God. So we have open hands to receive from God and open hands to give as well. We'll live open-handedly. Give us today the bread we need now is effective when we pray it with humility. Have some humility in our hearts and have gratitude in our hearts. Fasting, whether it's fasting from a meal or fasting for a day or whatever, but fasting is a way to be reminded that we are dependent on God. It's not by we don't live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Another thing that we could do. And then be generous. I think that's what's implied here. Be generous with what God has blessed you with. Be generous with what God has blessed you with. Again, we receive open-handed, we give, which is open-handed. Be part of God's answer to someone else's prayer. So when I agreed to preach this sermon today, I thought, this is going to be a simple lesson. This is good. But no, this is very challenging to me. It seems a simple message. But when I began thinking about this, when I began reflecting on this, meditating on this, and engaging in conversation with others, like other biblical scholars on this is very challenging to live out, to be dependent completely on God. It's easy to say, but to really live it out. So I need to continue reflecting on this as well. I'm going to challenge you to continue reflecting on this part of the prayer. Wrestle with what Jesus said about daily bread. when we have a fridge full of food, how do we live this out? How do we live a life that we recognize we are dependent on God for our very lives? How do we live a grateful life? And so what does faith in God to provide for my daily needs look like in a society in which you and I live? At the least, we should recognize that we are, of course, dependent on God, grateful to God, and to be generous with God's blessings to us. So may God bless us as we walk together in this journey of faith and into faith. May God bless us. Let's pray.